Coastal Maine, 1962. Vivian Odom had stopped expecting the phone to ring for her. She had stopped expecting anyone to ask what she thought about anything that mattered. She had stopped expecting the second cup in the cupboard to ever come down again. She was 61 years old. She had been married to Frank for 31 years before the heart attack took him standing at the register of his own hardware store. She had been alone for 5 years since. Somewhere in those 5 years she had settled into a shape of her life she had not chosen so much as worn in, the way a chair takes the print of the person who sits in it every evening. This was simply what her life was now. The town helped her get there, not unkindly. Doris Pruitt at the church bake sale, saying that a woman her age was lucky to still have her health. Lucky she didn't need to worry about all that anymore, said with a warm smile that left something cold behind it. Pastor Whitfield's wife telling her she was such an inspiration, so independent. In the particular tone people use for women, they've quietly filed away. Small words, said kindly, folded one on top of another for 5 years until Vivian stopped hearing them as opinions, and started hearing them as opinions and started hearing them as facts. She was in the garden on a Saturday morning in June, cutting back the roses Frank had planted along the fence, when a truck slowed on the road and stopped at her gate. Walter Cobb climbed down from the cab with a ladder strapped to the bed and his cap in his hand. "Morning, Mrs. Odom. Heard your gutter came loose in the storm. Brought a ladder." She looked at the ladder. She looked at him. She had known Walter Cobb the way you know a man in a town of 1,100 people, by name and by reputation and not much else. He was 64, widowed 3 years, ran the boatyard down at the harbor with the kind of steadiness men trusted with their engines and their money both. The sort of man people spoke of as reliable long before anyone thought to describe him as kind. "You brought a ladder," she said. "Didn't think you'd want to climb up there yourself," he said. She stepped back from the gate. "Lemonade's cold," she said. "Come sit when you're done." He almost smiled at that, the way a man smiles when he's gotten further than he expected to. It was the start of something neither of them had gone looking for, and both of them needed more than they would have said out loud. She had built a life worth defending, and she knew it. The Odom house sat 2 streets back from the harbor, small and square and hers outright since Frank's insurance cleared, with a garden that won compliments even from women who wouldn't otherwise give her one. She kept her own books, paid her own taxes, drove her own truck to the market on Wednesdays. When Frank died, she had grieved until there was nothing left to grieve with, and then, because the mortgage didn't care how she felt, she had gone back to keeping house and keeping herself. 5 years. She had learned to fix the porch step herself before she learned to ask a neighbor. She had made every decision in that house with the quiet authority of a woman who understood the roof didn't care whether the person under it was a widow or a wife. She was proud of that. She was also aware, on the evenings the radio was off and the house was too quiet to argue with, of what the pride didn't cover. The town saw a capable widow. Vivian saw the capable widow too. What she had stopped letting herself see was the woman underneath the capable one. The one who still set the table for 2 on the nights she wasn't paying close attention. The one who had heard Doris Pruitt and Pastor Whitfield's wife in 100 small comments over 5 years and had quietly, without meaning to, agreed with every one of them. She was 61 years old. That part of her life was finished, or so she had decided. So gradually she never caught herself deciding it, never noticed the exact evening that fine turned into enough, or the evening enough turned into all there was going to be. There had been a time, in the first year after Frank, when people had circled her more closely, brought casseroles, asked how she was really doing, sat with her on the porch on Sunday afternoons so the house wouldn't feel so large around her. That had thinned out the way it does. Not from unkindness, but from the ordinary drift of other people's lives moving on while hers stood still. Until what was left was a kind of polite distance dressed up as respect for her independence. She noticed it most at the market, where the butcher had long since stopped asking after her and started simply wrapping the same order he assumed she still wanted, and at church, where she sat in the same pew alone and had come to think of the space beside her as belonging to no one in particular. The way a room stops being anyone's once the furniture's been rearranged around the gap. Walter came back the following Saturday with a bag of steamers he claimed he'd caught too many of. Not a small bag. A bag meant for 2 people who intended to sit and eat them together. Vivian stood at the door and looked at the bag. "That's more clams than one man needs," she said. Boat was generous today, he said. I have a stove. I have butter.
He held butter. She took it.
She thanked him and closed the door and stood in her kitchen a long moment, telling herself this was a neighbor being neighborly, the way she had told herself the same thing about the ladder. He came the week after that to ask whether her chimney had been swept before winter set its mind on coming early. It hadn't. He knew a man free on Tuesday. She let him send the man. He came the week after that with no excuse prepared at all, simply stood at her gate on a Thursday evening and said he'd been down at the harbor and thought he'd see if the lemonade was still cold. It was. They sat on her porch for an hour and talked about Frank and about Walter's wife Ruth, gone 3 years now to a slow cancer that had taken its time about it. And it was the first conversation Vivian had had in 5 years with someone who understood exactly what that kind of loss cost and didn't try to talk her out of the price. When he left, she stood at the rail and watched his taillights go down toward the harbor road. He came again the following Tuesday, this time with nothing at all in his hands, and asked instead whether she'd like to ride down to the harbor with him to see a boat come in that he'd spent the better part of a year restoring for a customer from Bath. She said yes before she'd fully decided to, and stood beside him on the dock in the July heat, while the boat came in low and clean under its own new paint. And he explained the work with the particular quiet pride of a man who loves what he does and rarely gets asked about it. She realized on the drive back that she had laughed twice in an hour, an amount she couldn't remember managing in the 5 years prior, and that the realization itself was almost as startling as the laughing had been. At the bake sale that Saturday, Doris Prout found her by the pie table. Walter Cobb's been coming around your place, she said, not as an accusation, just a fact laid on the table between them. He fixed my gutter, Vivian said, and brought clams, Doris said, and sat on your porch Thursday last. You're well informed, Vivian said. It's a small harbor, Doris said, and then, after a pause that cost her something, he's a decent man, Vivian. He's a neighbor, Vivian said. Doris looked at her the way a woman looks at someone she's known 30 years and has decided not to argue with today. Of course, she said, and went back to her pies. Vivian stood at the table and thought about a man who had caught more clams than he needed on a Saturday and known exactly who to bring them to. She was not a woman who lied to herself for long. She sat with it on a Sunday afternoon and looked at the plain shape of things. Walter Cobb had come to her house 4 times in 3 weeks with a reason each time thinner than the last. He had fixed her gutter and sent a man for her chimney and brought food enough for 2 and sat on her porch with no excuse but wanting to. She knew what that added up to. She also knew what happened in her chest when his truck slowed at the gate, the particular lift of it. Unfamiliar enough after 5 years that she'd nearly mistaken it for something else the first time. She'd been pretending not to recognize it for 2 weeks running. The feeling was real. 61 years old and 5 years a widow, and she had heard Walter Cobb's truck on the road, and something in her had done something she'd told herself, quietly and repeatedly, it no longer did. And then, right behind the honest accounting, came Doris Prout's voice, and Pastor Whitfield's wife's voice. And every small kind comment stacked up over 5 years, all of them agreeing that a woman her age was past the part of life where this sort of thing happened, that she should be grateful for her health and her independence and leave it there. She thought about this for the better part of a week. On the 6th day, Walter left a jar of beach plum jelly on her porch rail while she was in the back cutting kindling, and left without knocking. Because that was simply how he did things, without making a production of them. She found it when she came around front. She stood on the porch with the jar in her hands and looked out at the harbor going copper in the evening light, and thought about the ladder and the clams and the man who'd caught extra on purpose. She thought about something her mother used to say, that she'd understood as a girl and only now, holding a jar of jelly on a Wednesday evening, understood completely. That the loneliest people aren't the ones with no one, but the ones who have someone standing at the gate and won't let themselves open it. She set the jelly on the table. She sat down at it, and for the first time in 5 years let herself consider that the people speaking kindly to her might also be wrong. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something. Most of you listening are somewhere in the middle of your own evening right now. Maybe you're driving home, maybe you're at the sink. Maybe you've got the radio low and the light going gold outside your window, same as Vivian's did. If this story's kept you company tonight, leave it a like. It genuinely helps more than you'd think. And tell me in the comments, what are you doing right now while you listen? I'd like to know. Now let's get back to it, because Vivian Odom has just decided something. And Vivian Odom, once she decides a thing, does not go back on it easily. He came for supper in September, invited on purpose this time, with no ladder or gutter or chimney to hide behind, which was itself an answer to a question she'd been asking herself for weeks. She had spent most of that Tuesday deciding and undeciding whether to ask him at all, had picked up the telephone twice and set it back down before finally dialing, and had stood in her kitchen afterward with her hand still on the receiver, faintly astonished at herself, at the nerve it had taken to do something so small. She cooked the way she used to cook for Frank on their anniversary. A whole chicken and biscuits from scratch, food she hadn't made for another living soul in 5 years. Walter arrived on time, looked at the table set properly with the good plates, and understood exactly what he was being shown and didn't pretend otherwise. They ate, and talked the way they'd been talking all summer, but underneath it sat something neither of them had said, until the plates were cleared and the coffee was poured, and the evening had gone fully dark outside the window. Vivian set down her cup. "Walter, I need to say something plainly." He waited, the way he always waited, without hurrying her toward it. 61 years old, she said, looking at her own hands on the table, hands that had kept a house and a garden and a ledger for 30 years. "I know what your visits have been," she said. "I'm not going to pretend I haven't." She looked up at him. "And I know what happens in me when I hear your truck slow at the gate." She held his eyes. "But people keep telling me, kindly, that this part of my life is finished, that I ought to be satisfied with what I've got and not go looking for more." Her voice caught somewhere it hadn't given her permission to catch. I think I'd started to believe them. The kitchen was very quiet. Walter reached across the table and took both her hands in his, the broad, weathered hands of a man who'd spent 30 years hauling engines out of boats. He looked at her steadily. "Vivian," he said, "they're wrong." She looked at him. "I'm 64, he said. "I spent 3 years after Ruth telling myself the same thing, that my part was played out, that whatever came next was just the waiting." He held her hands tighter. "Then I caught more clams than I needed on a Saturday and drove them straight to your door before I could talk myself out of it. And I went home that night and couldn't stop thinking about you." "That isn't what a neighbor does," he said. "They're wrong," he said again, simply. "The way a man states a fact he's checked twice. About you, about me, about what people our age are allowed to still want." She sat with that a long moment, the harbor dark and quiet through the window behind him. "Walter," she said finally, "I want to be honest with you about something too." "Go on," he said. "I am not going to become a different woman than I already am," she said. "This house is mine outright. I keep my own books, and I make my own decisions, and I have for 5 years, and I don't intend to stop making them." "I wouldn't want you to," he said. "I'll accept help when I need it," she said, "and I'll tell you plainly when I do and when I don't. That's all I'm asking of you in return," he said. She looked at him for a long time. Then she turned her hands over in his and held on. "All right," she said. "Let's see what the rest of it looks like then." The town noticed by October. Walter's truck parked outside the Odom house on a Sunday afternoon was the sort of thing 1,100 people notice within the hour. The reactions ran about as Vivian expected, the raised eyebrow at the market, the look passed between 2 women at the post office. Doris Prout found her after church. "Good," she said, "just that." Vivian looked at her. "I said a foolish thing to you back in the spring," Doris said, "about being grateful for your health and leaving it there. I've turned it over some. I was wrong to say it." "Yes," Vivian said, "you were." She didn't make it easy on Doris, and she didn't make it hard either. It was simply the truth, and Doris had said it, and that was sufficient. What Vivian did not do was change how she lived. She still kept her own books, still drove her own truck to market, still made her own calls about the roof and the garden and every decision that came with owning a house outright. What changed was that Walter was there now, not managing things for her, but alongside her, and it was not a small difference. And she noticed it every day. One Saturday in November, the porch step Frank had never gotten around to fixing finally gave way under her foot, and she went down hard onto the walk, catching her wrist under her before she could think to protect it properly. She sat in the cold a moment and took stock. Wrist that ached in a way she didn't like. Knee that would bruise, pride considerably the worse for wear. She got herself up. She iced the wrist at the kitchen sink and said nothing to anyone. Walter found out 3 days later when he saw her favoring the hand while she poured his coffee. He stopped and looked at her. "The porch step," he said, not a question. "It finally went," she said. "I meant to get to it before the frost. I'd have come Thursday if you told me," he said. "I know," she said. He was quiet a moment, then sat down at her table. "Vivian," he said, "asking for help isn't the same thing as being unable to manage." "I know that," she said. "I'm still learning it though." "So am I," he said, "still learning plenty myself." She sat with him at her own table with her wrist wrapped. The November evening settling gray over the harbor outside, and neither of them said anything else for a while, because nothing else needed saying yet. "Next time," she said finally, "I'll call before it happens instead of after." "Next time," he said, "I'll come whether you call or not, but I'd rather you called." He didn't fix the step that night, though she half expected him to. Tools and all, the way a certain kind of man reaches for a hammer the moment he's uncomfortable with a feeling. Instead, he just sat with her until the coffee went cold, and it occurred to her later, alone in bed with her wrist propped on a pillow, that this had mattered more than the fixing would have. She had spent 5 years being fixed for, or fixing things herself, and had never once considered that a person could simply sit beside the broken thing without rushing to repair it, and that this, too, was its own kind of care. Spring came back to the harbor the way it does after a long Maine winter, all at once and gratefully. They fixed the porch step together in April, Vivian holding the boards and Walter with the hammer, which wasn't the most efficient way to do it and was exactly how they both wanted it done. She had been turning something over since November, about Frank, about 31 years of a good marriage, and what it had cost her when it ended, about whether she was doing right by his memory. She came to an answer she trusted. Frank had loved her whole and complete, and he would not have wanted that love turned into a wall she lived behind for the rest of her life. On an April evening, she asked Walter to stay after the work was done, and they sat on the mended step and looked out at the harbor going the particular pink it goes in spring. "Walter," she said. He waited, the way he always did, without pressing her toward it. "I've been a widow 5 years," she said, "and I told myself that was simply what I'd become, that it was enough on its own." She looked out at the water. "It was enough," she said. "I want to be clear about that." "It was," he said. "It is," she said. "And I'm also a woman who felt something in June when a truck slowed at her gate that she'd have sworn she wasn't capable of feeling anymore." She looked at him. "I don't entirely know what to do with that. I know what I'd like to do with it. I'm not certain I'm allowed to want it." Walter looked at her, at the woman who kept her own books and mended her own porch step and had just said the truest thing she'd said to another person in 5 years, and he took her hand where it rested on the step between them. "Vivian Odom," he said. "I drove straight here with a bag of clams I didn't need because I couldn't stand the thought of eating them alone, and I would like to stop pretending that meant nothing." She looked at their hands together on the wood. "My name stays on this house," she said. "It will," he said. "And I keep my own books." "I'd worry if you stopped," he said. She looked at him a long moment, and then she smiled. The real one. The one that took over her whole face and hadn't shown up in 5 years. Somewhere down at the harbor, a bell buoy was ringing slow and irregular with the swell, the sound she'd fallen asleep to for 30 years and had stopped hearing until just that moment when it seemed to arrive in her all at once, along with everything else she'd stopped letting herself notice. "Walter Cobb," she said, "is there something you'd like to ask me?" He looked at her, looked out at the harbor, looked back, and asked. They were married in June at the little white church on the hill. The harbor spread out silver below them. The whole town turned out on a Saturday morning warm enough to leave the doors propped open. It wasn't a large wedding. Neither of them wanted large. Doris Prout sat in the second pew and had brought a pie, set it out in the church hall before the service with the particular satisfaction of a woman making her amends through butter and sugar instead of words. Vivian wore pale blue, not white, because white had never once been the point. Her gray hair pinned the way it would be in the photograph the town kept afterward, her face carrying 61 years of weather and work and not apologizing for a single line of it. Walter stood at the front in his one good suit, and watched her come up the aisle and thought about a woman who looked at a ladder in her yard and said, "Come sit when you're done." She came toward him thinking about a porch step, and a man who'd said, "I'd come whether you call or not." The vows were short. Afterward, on the church steps, the whole harbor gathered around them, and Doris hugged Vivian with the plain warmth of a woman glad to have been proven wrong. And Vivian hugged her back without any of the careful distance she used to keep, because the year past had taught her exactly what that distance cost and what it felt like to finally set it down. They kept the house in Vivian's name. That was her decision, and Walter hadn't argued it, because he'd understood it before she said a word. The Odom house stayed hers, her work, her 30 years of knowing exactly how it wanted to be kept. Walter moved his things in because the house was wherever Vivian was, and wherever Vivian was where he wanted to be. The years went the way good years go. She kept her own books and her own garden with the same precision she always had. And Walter worked alongside her rather than over her, and what the two of them knew together turned out to be more than what either had known alone. In 1964, the garden won first prize at the Harbor Fair for the first time in a decade. In 1966, they planted a second rosebush by the fence, and neither of them said much about it, but both understood exactly what it meant. In 1967, Walter sold the boatyard to his nephew and kept only the workbench in the shed behind the house, where he spent his mornings restoring small skiffs for anyone in town who asked more for the company of the work than for what it paid. The town went on the way towns do. Doris retired down to her sister's place in Portland and wrote at Christmas every year, and Vivian wrote back every January without fail. The pastor's wife, who'd once called her an inspiration in that particular hollow way, retired too, replaced by a younger woman who simply liked Vivian and said so plainly, without any undertone at all, which Vivian found she still noticed, still appreciated after all this time. Walter's hair went fully white by 68. Vivian's followed not long after. Neither one minded. On an evening in the fall of 1969, 7 years after Walter Cobb had first parked a truck at her gate with a ladder in the back, they sat on the mended porch step and watched the harbor go from silver to copper to the deep blue that comes right before full dark. Walter had his coffee. Vivian had a book she wasn't reading, watching instead the rose bushes along the fence. The old one Frank had planted, and the new one they'd put in together, and the harbor beyond it that she had built a whole second life around. "Walter," she said. He looked over. "I nearly didn't answer the gate that first Saturday," she said. "I know," he said. "I circled the block twice before I worked up the nerve to stop the truck." She stared at him. "Twice?" "The ladder was heavy," he said, deadpan, and she laughed, the real laugh, the one that changed her whole face, and he smiled, the one that changed his. They sat there on the step while the harbor went dark and the roses held their last color of the season, and Vivian Odom, who had once been told, kindly, that she was past the part of life where any of this happened, and had very nearly believed it, was 68 years old, sitting beside a man who'd once brought her more clams than any one person could eat. And it was, by every measure that mattered to her, exactly right. Vivian Odom had stopped expecting certain things. She'd arrived there the way people do, through the slow accumulation of small, kind comments from people who meant well and were wrong, not cruel, never cruel. Just certain in the easy way people get certain about lives that aren't their own, certain that a woman past 60 belonged to a chapter that didn't include this. She was allowed to have believed them for a while. What mattered was what she did the Saturday a truck slowed at her gate with a ladder in the back, and a man climbed down with his cap in his hand. She let him in. Not all at once. She was Vivian, and Vivian had built something worth keeping over 5 hard years, and wasn't going to hand any of it over carelessly. She let it in the way a careful woman lets something in, slowly, eyes open, with the whole cost accounted for. She fell on her own porch step in November and got up and iced her wrist alone and said nothing for 3 days, and then sat at her table and said, "Next time I'll call." That's what strength actually looks like. Not the kind that refuses everything that's offered. Not the pride that falls down and gets back up and never tells a soul. The kind that builds something real, and then when someone worth trusting stops his truck at the gate, opens it, and when she falls, says so. Walter told her they were wrong, and they were, and Vivian, who had kept her own books and mended her own porch and never once needed rescuing, decided to believe him anyway, at 61 years old, on a Saturday morning in June, with the better part of her life still ahead of her. It's never too late. It's never too old. Open the gate. There is a version of this story where Vivian keeps the gate closed, where the latter gets returned with a polite thank you and nothing more, where she goes on setting the table for two out of habit and calling it nothing, and grows old in a house that stays exactly as quiet as she decided it was going to be. That version happens more often than anyone likes to say out loud, not because the Walters of the world stop showing up, but because the gate stays shut long enough that eventually they stop trying it. Vivian's version is the other one, the harder one. The one that required her to admit, out loud, at 61, that she had been wrong about her own life. That's the part worth remembering, longer than the wedding or the roses or the porch step. Not that love found her, that she let it. So if you're somewhere tonight wondering whether your own gate is worth opening again, let this be your answer. Until next time, take care of each other.